Welcome to another exciting foray into Mark IV VW transmission swaps. This series is going to be focusing on the 01M automatic transmission swap into a manual. The previous series was for the 09A. There was those two automatics through the Mark IV era. And there's pretty good difference between the two of them as to what you need to do. The 01M is significantly easier. Now, it depends where you look when the 01M switched to the 09A in the Mark IVs. Some references will say it was 2002, some will say it was 2004. Before you get too deep, confirm what transmission you have. So one of the first things you want to do is determine if you have an 01M or an 09A automatic transmission in your car. And if you don't know, and you can't find the tag on the transmission to tell you, here's a couple of things you can look at to help you decide, or determine rather. The easiest is to simply look at your shifter. So if you look here at the shifter, you can see this is straight, and it's a 3-speed. It's actually a 4-speed transmission, but it only labels to 3rd gear. But see how that's straight? This is the 01M. All right, the Tiptronic, or the 09A, has an outset here where you can push that shifter to the right when it's in drive and sort of manually shift it back and forth. And that's the easiest way to tell. Here's another look at comparing the 01M versus the 09A shifter differences. On the right here is an 01M, and you see that the shifter is straight, or the shifter slot. These two are from an 09A, one is from a Beetle, one is from a Jetta, and you can see the difference. That's the slot I was talking about for the Tiptronic function of the 09A. So if you have that little cutout to the side in your shifter slot, then you have an 09A or maybe an 09G, whereas if it's straight, you have an 01M. Looking in the engine bay is a little harder until you start getting some stuff out. So if you're wanting to determine this before you start taking your car apart, it's a little bit more challenging. So we're going to look down in there and I'll see if I can point out something here. The 01M, the pan to the transmission, is on the bottom. So you look underneath the car and it looks just like the oil pan that's on your engine. The 09A has the pan on the front of the transmission, which is kind of strange. So it will be up here in the front underneath the battery tray. And if you look from this angle and you see a pan that looks like an oil pan on the front, that will be an 09A and not the 01M. The 01M is a little bit easier to do because you don't have to mess with the VSS circuit, which is fantastic. It's a whole lot less wiring, which we like. So as I mentioned, this video series is going to be about doing the 01M transmission swap to a manual. Our example here is a 2003, and this happens to be a TDI, which one of the advantages of the TDI, this is an ALH diesel, is that you can retune the ECU to make it a manual, whereas the gas engines, you cannot. You have to send it off, unless you're EEPROM tuner, you got to send it off to someone that can do some EEPROM tuning. With VCDS, I can change this ECU into being a manual ECU and the appropriate fueling and timing issues. So that's one of the advantages. I'm going to try to cover, especially when we get to the wiring, some of the other cars. Of course, we'll cover an ALH from an 01M to a, in this case we're doing a 6-speed, but I'll try to cover 1.8s, 2.0s, and the VR6. The good thing about the gas engine is the wiring is almost identical between the 3 gas engines. Well, H are different, and they have some differences depending on the year, particularly when you get into the BEWs. But those are all with the 09A, so we're not going to worry about the BEWs in this video series. So we're going to cover getting everything out the wiring and plumbing that you need to do that's easier to do while everything's out of your way, and then getting everything back in. All right, so I've got a big pile of parts here to do my transmission swap. But what are all the parts that I need? It's going to be just a little bit more than what you expect. Obviously, you're going to need the transmission. Whether it's a 5-speed or a 6-speed, depends what you're building, but some of these things are going to be specific to that transmission. So make sure you get what matches that transmission. For example, the bracket that holds the shift cables are different between the 5-speed and the 6-speed. So this bracket is not the right one. I had to make sure I got the right one for the 6-speed. So the transmission, the cable bracket, the shift linkage, right? Here's the actual shift linkage, and that can change on different transmissions, so make sure you got the right one. Make sure you have the cable ends, because you are going to need the shift box, right? And the automatic shift box only has one cable, so we need a whole new shift box. Here it is, the 2 cables, and those are the cable ends already on the cable. That's what attaches onto this linkage on top. So we need the shift box. We need the clutch pedal with the 2 switches that are attached on it, and the hose that provides fluid into the clutch master cylinder. So there's a gray, or sometimes it's white switch here, and a blue switch. You need that little bracket. And there's also another piece that bolts on and bridges over to your brake pedal when you install this correctly. So you need that and that. Obviously, you need all the bolts that go along with both of these. You need the correct axles, both of them, for the transmission you are installing. The automatic transmission axles don't work with the manual transmissions, and the manual transmissions have different length axles between 5 and 6 speed and different size bolts. So you got to get the matching axles. I mentioned the clutch pedal and the hose that goes to the master cylinder. Now you need the hose that comes from here down to the slave cylinder that's mounted in the transmission. All right, you can get a used one at the junkyard, but I opted to go for a new one here from ECS. Plenty of different places you can get it, but this is a nice stainless steel one that won't expand, so it'll give a nice firm clutch feel. Should have mentioned this along with the shift tower, but you're going to need the boot and shift knob. The transmission, they're all different for the starters. So you need the starter that fits the transmission that you're installing. 5-speed different than 6-speed, different than automatic. Sometimes it's very, very subtle. And in my example here, this is a 6-speed and this is an automatic. And they're just slightly different depth, not interchangeable. So make sure you have the correct starter. Working towards the engine, you need the correct backing plate. The one that comes on the automatic isn't quite right. You can cut and drill and make it work, but I would recommend just getting the one that fits the transmission that you're putting in. Working the other way, the bracket that goes to the transmission mount, hold it to the body. All right, you're going to have to take it off as you're getting that transmission out of the car if you're pulling one at the junkyard. If you just order one off of eBay or get it used from some other dismantler, it might not come with the bracket. So you got to make sure you have the right bracket. They, again, are all different between, here's the auto, the 5-speed, and the 6-speed are all different. So for this transmission, the O2M, there's the correct bracket. If your transmission mount is in good shape, you can reuse it. That is the same mount. But it might be worn out, so you might want to get a new transmission mount. Then, of course,
the clutch, and we need the full assembly. So I prefer to just get a kit. I don't like to use a used clutch, so I just buy an entire kit. So here's one from Vallejo with a single mass flywheel, and it includes the throwout bearing, which I recommend a new throwout bearing, and this is actually the slave cylinder for the clutch. On the 6-speed, it mounts inside. On the 5-speed, it mounts on top. And then the throwout bearing is separate. On the 6-speed, it's all in one unit. But you're going to need the throwout bearing and the slave cylinder, and that's another one of the things I recommend just getting new instead of used from the junkyard. You need the pressure plate and the clutch plate, obviously, but then you're also gonna need the flywheel. And clutch kits are specific to transmissions. So this is a single mass flywheel for the diesel engine that fits an O2M 6-speed transmission. The 5-speed and 6-speed clutches and flywheels are not interchangeable, and the O2M and O2Q 6-speed transmissions are not interchangeable. So make sure that you're getting the correct flywheel for the transmission that you're putting in. Speaking of transmissions, I should have mentioned when we first started that this is a diesel geared 6-speed. Very uncommon. You don't find them in the US. It got imported from Europe. Physically, all the 4-cylinder vehicles' transmissions will bolt up to all the engines, but they're all geared just a little bit differently. So if you're doing a diesel, stick with a diesel geared transmission. It might sound like you could save a little bucks and, oh, I'll just shift earlier. You will not be happy with a gas geared transmission in your diesel. Conversely, if you have a gas powered car and you try to put a 2.0 transmission into your 1.8, you are going to run out of gears, and that's a bummer. So I recommend sticking with the transmission that is the code and the gearing for the engine that you have. Physically, will all fit, but gearing wise, it's different. So stick with the correct transmission for the car that you're putting it in. Obviously, we need the bolts for all of this stuff and nuts. The transmission to engine bolts, the bolts to hold the bracket on that hold the cables, the nut that holds the shift linkage on, the little clips that hold the pivots on, the two nuts and 2 bolts. There'll be 2 nuts go here. I'm sorry, 2 bolts go there and 2 nuts go here on the shift linkage. You'll need 4 different nuts to put in your pedal. Of course, the axles should have the correct bolts. They got to have the right thread and be the right length. So you need the right bolts for both your axles. And they're not depicted here because I've already put them up, but all of the pigtails or the connectors with the wires on them for these 2 switches, your backup switch, and then you'll be able to reuse from the O1M. It'll plug straight in here, so you don't need to worry about the VSS or the speed sensor. But make sure you get that backup sensor connector. And that's your pile of parts that you'll need. Again, clutch, the clutch plate, flywheel I recommend new. You can use used. You can get a used one. Axles, some people prefer to go with new ones. They're not near as hard to change as a clutch, so I'm not as scared of putting in a used axle if it looks good and the boot is good. But you can kind of feel it, feel if there's much slop, see if the boot is intact. If there's any rips in the boot, Don't put it on until you either re-grease it and put a new boot on, or just put a new one on. So that's my spiel on the parts needed to do a manual swap into an 01M equipped, automatic equipped Mark IV. So I've gotten a little work done, and now we can see some of the things that we're going to do. I took off the wipers and the wiper cowl and the cabin air filter cover. So that gives us access to the wiring harness there that we need. That's the ECU, and the TCU is tucked. There's the TCU. So we're going to get into that with the wiring. The battery and the battery box are out, and the air box is out, and then the air intake tube. So now we can see down in here a couple of the things we're going to do. First thing, and this is the beauty of the 01M swap. So back in here is where the VSS or the speed sensor hooks up. All right, that's the connector on the 01M. And cool part is, here's the connector for the manual transmission I'm putting in. Both the O2J and the O2M take the same connector. So for the 01M swap, all you have to do is plug that back in when you get your new transmission in. Now we have this cooler to deal with. There's two 1/2-inch hoses that come in and out. So all we're going to do is pop those off and put a 1/2-inch connector on it. I find that a 1/2-inch 90 works best. You can make it work with a straight 1/2-inch connector. For right now, I'm just going to pop them off and put them on here. And then once the transmission's out, I'll cut this hose back and make it a nice clean 90. So this will be sitting there, and this one will stretch back and come on right here. And so that'll take care of the coolant issue. Then there's 4 electrical connectors to take off. One there, one here, and those are the 2 main ones. And then there's another speed sensor down here to take that connector off, and one back. There we go, that works a little better. One back there. So 4 connectors, and I'll take this harness and flip it up where the battery was and flip it out of the way. Then we'll be ready to drop the transmission. Well, when we're unbolting it, there's a ground connector here, and it's just a ground, so it goes on one of the transmission bolts. So is it electrical connection or is it the transmission mount? I'm going to pull these out. There's a bolt. Well, it's supposed to be it's supposed to be on that bolt right there. That's the transmission bolt. Transmission and starter bolt holds the starter onto the transmission and then the transmission to the engine. So we'll move those up out of the way. Normally there's a 13mm nut, and there's a tab on the bottom of this wire holder, but it is missing. It's not there. So don't be surprised if you actually have to go underneath the car, reach just above the starter, and get that 13mm nut off before you can get to the bolts. Then underneath the car, I've taken out both axles on both sides. I took off the lower transmission mount, the dog bone. You can see it laying there. So the transmission is hanging by being bolted to the engine and this mount here at the moment. And I'll get some support for it here shortly. Took the drive axles off underneath, undid the exhaust, and slid out the exhaust shield so I could get to the 2 bolts that are underneath on the shift mechanism. All right, this is the one that's going in, but I'm just using this as an example. There's 2 bolts from underneath the car that you need to get to drop the shift box. We'll have to go into the car and do the rest of that. We'll do the rest of that in the car. But for right now, we're going to take that starter off, get those electrical connectors off, and then that transmission will be ready to get supported and unbolted and lowered out of the car. There's two ways, well, there's probably a multitude of ways, but the two main ways is you can use an engine support bar that comes across the fenders here to hang the engine on, and then either a jack underneath for the transmission or an engine hoist from the top. Or you can put a jack underneath the engine and then use another jack or the engine hoist for the transmission. My favorite is to put the jack underneath the engine because I find that the engine support bar set up here gets in my way all the time, and it makes it hard to get down into the transmission to get the bolts out. So I like to use a jack with a piece of wood up on the oil pan of the engine to support the engine. Then I hook the engine hoist up to the transmission and then start taking out these top bolts and this mount, and then it'll be hanging on the engine stand, and I can lower it down onto a dolly or whatever to get it out from underneath the car. I'm lucky that I'm on a lift, so if I need to change something, it's easy enough to lift the car up and down. If you're using jack stands, you're doing this in your driveway or your garage or whatever, and you're on jack stands, make sure you get it on stands high enough that you'll have the room to slide the transmission out underneath the bumper. So I'm probably going to have to bring that up just a little bit more to have room to slide that transmission out. But I'll wait until I have the transmission hanging before I bring the car up a little bit. But if you're putting it up on stands, make sure you get it up on stands high enough that you'll be able to get that transmission out.
The transmission is now out of the car, which is a huge step and kind of a battle. I didn't film every single process because that's fairly simple stuff to look up in the Bentley or figure out, and not the kind of detail that you need the little tricks and tips of the trade. But one thing I will add, when you're taking the transmission out, one of the first things I do is take the flex plate bolts off. So you'll see these holes here, there's 3 of them, and that's where the flex plate bolts up, and the transmission will not come out, the automatic transmission will not come out unless you have those 3, it's actually a nut, you take those 3 nuts off. So I do that before I take the axles out. It's accessed from under the car through this notch in the backing plate right here, and you have to turn the engine over until that you can see them through the access port. And what that looks like looking at the transmission is these 3 threaded studs, 1, 2, 3, are accessed through that port, and there's a 16 millimeter, it's usually a 16 millimeter nut on those, and that holds the flex plate to the torque converter here. And it's really difficult to get the transmission out unless you take those off. So don't forget those. I've done it before. You get the engine the transmission all unbolted, and you're trying to slide it off the engine and it won't go. It's probably those 3 bolts. So I usually do that first now while I'm under the car. So now that the transmission is out, I'm going to do the wiring. I like to do the wiring and the pedal install while the transmission is out, simply for access. It's a whole lot easier, especially when you're putting the pedal in and running the lines for the slave cylinder from there to here and down. So the next step is going to be taking apart some wiring harness. For example, this is the wiring harness that went to the transmission, right? There's 4 plugs on it, 2 there, 1 there, and 1 down here. I'm going to take this all apart, strip all of the tape off it and all this protectant all the way back to right where it comes out of this channel. And then as I start my wiring, I'll know how long I need to leave the wires. Don't forget
to protect your VSS connector back here that you unplugged. It will just plug straight into the new transmission. Up in the plenum chamber, we're going to take the TCU plug off. So here's the TCU, and it's really hard to see, but to get it off, you have to grab these two tabs and pull it that way, and this connector will come off, and then we'll unwrap that. This is the 121 pin connector to the ECU, which we're going to change one pin on this. So here's a bench look at what you need to do to the pedal. So this brake pedal has already been altered. The problem is an automatic has this plate on it, and that will interfere with the clutch pedal that you're now installing with this extension. So the cheap fix is just to cut this off with a die grinder once you pull the rubber pedal pad off. The problem with that is a short pedal pad won't fit on top of this plate, so you'll just be left with this plate, and it's really slick when it's wet. That surface is very smooth, so I recommend against that. So you can either drill out the welds, as I've done here. Okay, I just drilled out those 4 welds. Sometimes there's also a weld down the side here that you have to cut, and that can be tough, and it can be really tough to do in the car, but it is possible. I've done plenty that way, of just cutting that plate off in the car and then grind it smooth so that the manual style pedal pad will fit on there. But underneath that big plate is the same profile as a standard manual car pedal, which is what you see here. Now, you can just change out the pedal, and these are pretty cheap when you get one at the junkyard, but there's a couple of challenges to it. One is that there is a difference in some of the pedals. So if you line up the pivot point, you'll see that this little detent here, or this little knob, is at a different place. To get the pedal out, first you have to release the ball joint that's in the back. And that can be tough, and it can be really tough to do without breaking this plastic insert. So you see there's this plastic insert here that the ball to the piston on the master cylinder sets down in there, and those 2 teeth or tangs hold on to that ball. And that can get really tough to release. You can push these 6, there's 3 on each side. You can push those out, and sometimes you can get that plastic insert to pop out. The way it's really designed to be done is with a brake pedal removal tool, that when the brake pedal is installed, before you take the pivot out, you reach up behind it, set this on the shaft of the piston, slide it up, and then that will push those 2 tangs down so you can pop the ball end out. So you pull on that a little bit, and it pushes those 2 plastic tabs down, and the ball will pop out when you pull a little bit on the bottom of the pedal. If you take that pivot off first, it doesn't work very well. So you want to release that ball before you take the pivot out. Then it's just a matter of taking this nut and bolt out for the pivot, and that pedal will come right out. Now be aware there is a bushing in here. Make sure you don't lose that, because if you just put the bolt through without that pivot, there'll be a whole lot of slop in your brake pedal, and that is a bad thing. So make sure you keep track of that pivot bushing. Once you cut that pad off, now a manual style pedal pad will fit right on there. And if you want to get the fancy GTI style ones, they'll fit on the same as these, or you can just go with the standard one. Make sure you get where you were drilling and cutting smoothed down a little bit so that pedal, this, I don't know if you can see in the center there, is a piece that fits through this hole. It's a whole lot easier to do out of the car, but like I said,
Every time I try to do this with screwdrivers, I end up breaking it. So I bought the $30 tool, and that works pretty well. It's still a little bit of a job. Can be done in the car. I've done them both ways. Take your pick of whether you'd rather fight being up under the dashboard, kind of on your side with the seat in the way, or you want to go through the hassle of taking that out. Now, you can get this part still from the dealer and some other places. So if you break it, you're not SOL, but that will delay you because then you got to order it and it takes 3 weeks to come in, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe try one in the junkyard and see if you can get that off without breaking it, and then you have an extra if you can get one out of the junkyard. But that's the alteration that you have to do to the brake pedal, because your new clutch pedal is going to be, there'll be a conflict if you don't take this plate off. Again, this car just had the 5 spot welds there that I just drilled them out and then ground them down a little bit. A lot of times there is those spot welds and then another bead along right here. And you can grab this with a channel locks or a vice grip or something and kind of bend it up a little bit if it's in the car, so that you can get to that spot weld or that bead weld without cutting into your pedal. Make sure you don't cut into the pedal. Obviously, you don't want to weaken your brake pedal here. So that's the modifications that you need to do to your brake pedal so that the clutch pedal will properly fit. In the automatics, there is an additional shift lock that's a mechanical with a cable in it, and it's next to impossible to film it in the car. So here I have it on the bench so I can show you what I did to get it out. Since we're not reusing it, I'm not worried about saving it, and I like to just cut them. I just use a big cable cutter. Basically what you have is this cable attaches there, so it has to be in park to allow you to run the ignition. The other end of this cable runs up to the ignition, up through the steering column. So you can, if you can get enough slack in it, put it up into park, and it's designed so that you can pull that cable up over this little detent here, and this little pin will come up, much like a bicycle brake cable. If you can pull that up enough and then work it up, well, it doesn't usually come out that easy. But that can, when there's tension on that cable, that can be really tough. Once you get the cable undone, you have to push a couple of tabs here to let this black piece disengage from the shifter housing. I find it much quicker and more efficient to simply cut it with a cable cutter. I cut it right here and then follow that cable up into the steering column. And I don't remove the steering column. Just as soon as I see that cable coming out, I cut off that piece underneath the steering column. So I end up with this cut piece of cable housing. Doesn't hurt anything to leave the piece on the ignition. If you really want to, you can pull the steering wheel off, take the airbag out of the steering wheel, pull the steering wheel off, and then pull the housing that goes around the steering column. The steering column covers, pull those off, and disengage the other end of this cable up on the ignition. But that's a lot of work for very little payoff, so I find it works fine just to cut it here so you can get this shifter out, and then cut up in the steering column so you don't have a cable hanging down out of your steering column. Once that is off and you have disengaged the other end of the shift cable here from the transmission, there's 2 nuts that you get from inside the car underneath the cover, and then there's 2 bolts from underneath the car that you get, and then this will drop right out the bottom of the car if you have the exhaust out of the way. Then the reverse to install the manual shift box is basically the same. The 2 bolts from underneath the car and then the 2 nuts from inside the car, and then route those cables. There'll be 2 cables on the manual. Route them above the heat shield, which you have to remove that heat shield above the exhaust on the bottom of the car to be able to get this shift box in and out. Unless you cut it, but then you'll have no heat shield there. So I recommend just taking the heat shield off. That pretty well wraps up disassembly and removal. So the next video will be a very in-depth look at the wiring that we need to do. And then the final video will be all the reassembly. Let me reiterate that the Bentley manual is a fantastic guide. I skipped over a lot of stuff. Like, there's tons of videos and other information out there already about removing the axles, removing the dog bone, etc. Bentley manual is a great place to go for that too. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you soon for the electrical video. Take care.